Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and I'm glad to be with you today, and I hope this will be a good time for you. We're into the second lesson of a unit of lessons where we're looking at the idea of how everything in our world has its origin in God, and how we don't want to get so caught up in the world and in the things of the world that we forget that God is the source of all those things, and it is because of Him that we have what we have, and that we who we are, and that our situation is such as that it is, with all the resources and blessings and all the order and the things that we find in the world around us. Last week we looked at Psalm 104, and if you weren't listening to that lesson, I'd encourage you to go back and read Psalm 104. It's a beautiful psalm where the psalmist is setting and observing, meditating upon creation, and having that sense of awe that you and I often feel. Probably every one of us have had at least one or two significant incidences where we have been touched in nature by the presence of God. And yet we don't want to get so caught up in nature. We don't want to get so caught up in the world and in the things of the world that we forget the origin of all those things, and that is God Himself. Today's lesson, we're going to Leviticus. And Leviticus can be, well, it can be a little bit dry sometimes because it's a book of basically rules and regulations. It contains a lot of the comments that God made to Moses on Mount Sinai, some of the things that He's dictated to Moses to give to the people as guidelines and rules for living their lives together. In fact, the first part of Leviticus, or Leviticus chapters 13 through 26, are often clarified as a holiness code. It's a code to live by and to be holy, to be God's people. Holiness emphasizing our being separated, set aside to be God's people. And so in those chapters, we find a lot of rules and regulations and guidelines that have to do with maintaining our holiness and maintaining our role as being representatives of God in the world around us. Today we're going to get into one of those holiness codes where God has given, through Moses, some very specific guidance about stewardship of the land. And, we talked last week about how all the creatures and all parts of creation had their origin in God, and it's God as the creator that we want to stay focused on. Well, here God is giving Moses some guidelines about, along with that sense of God's creation, we also need to continue to emphasize the fact that God has given human beings, given mankind, the role of being stewards of all of these things. We are the one part of creation that has the ability to discern how things work, to begin to use those resources and develop them into other types of things other than what we just find in raw materials in the earth. And yet at the same time, God calls us that as we do that, remember that it's not those things that we are enamored with, it's God Himself. And be thankful to God for all those things that He's given to us. Well, Moses and God were talking about the people setting their lives up in the promised land, and how in that situation they would be a very agrarian society. They would be farming and living. The land would be absolutely the thing that sustained them. And last week in that psalm we saw how through the land God provided us human beings with edible fruits and vegetation and other things that we could garden and work together with to produce food for ourselves and to sustain ourselves. And I like that idea. I'm a bit of a gardener myself. I've certainly never been a commercial farmer, never been someone who tried to produce food for more than my own family and maybe share the excess with neighbors and friends and other extended family. And yet I'm aware of that process of farming and how it really does remind you of how God can take even the most basic things, the very soil of the earth, the thing that we take so for granted, dirt, and he can make from it what sustains us and keeps us going and enlightens our lives and gives us uh, all the things that we need. And so listen with that thought in mind as we read this first section of Leviticus chapter 25. We're going to read verses 1 through 7, and then we'll stop and talk about those for a second. The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, once you enter the land that I am giving you, the land must celebrate a Sabbath rest to the Lord. You will plant your fields for 6 years and prune your vineyards and gather their crops for 6 years. But in the seventh year, the land will have a special Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You must not plant your fields or prune your vineyards. You must not harvest the secondary growth of your produce or gather the grapes of your freely growing vines. It will be a year of special rest for the land. Whatever the land produces during its Sabbath will be your food, for you, for your male and female servants, and for your hired laborers and foreign guests who live with you, as well as for your livestock and for the wild animals in your land. All of the land's produce can be eaten." God had a plan. God shared that plan with Moses. And like with sometimes with many of God's ideas and God's plans, we don't get it. It's kind of, we're a little bit like when we were talking about pre-Easter and talking about how Jesus kept talking to the disciples about how he would die and be buried and resurrect. Sometimes it just goes over our heads, and I think some of this kind of went over the Israelites' heads. They didn't really understand it. So I did a little research on this and concept, and I found that this idea of giving the land a rest was a accepted way of doing farming in that day by peoples other than just the Jewish people. And so some of this is God is saying they've got the right idea. Now you use that idea, but use it in the context of Sabbath. You know, the Sabbath is the seventh day. And on the seventh day, God rested. And he calls you and I to take a Sabbath rest, to take a time when we'll draw aside from just the everyday hustle and bustle of life and focus ourselves on relationship with God and studying his word, being with his people, fellowship, gathering together, worshiping and praising praise to him, and having that special time of drawing aside and again reorienting ourselves on where it all came from and what it's really all about. It's all about God. And God says that principle not only serves you well as human beings, but it serves the land well. So every seventh year, I want you to not raise crops on your land. I want you to, if you've got vineyards there, I don't want you to go in and prune them. I don't want you to be doing things to make them produce more fruit or whatever it is you do. I just want you to let them rest, to let them go through that natural process of the soil regenerating itself. All the things that are in the soil, the worms and the bacteria and the things that, you know, we might kind of go, ew, when we think about it, but that are so important to the liveliness of the crops. And allow those things to regenerate and renew on their own. God says, I have set into place a process of renewal. And by letting the land rest every 7 years, it will go through this process of renewal. Now, he didn't say go in and cut down your vineyard on the land and so that the land could fully rest. He just said, go in and don't use that produce from that land for commercial means. You can eat it. You can share it with your friends. It's to be openly usable and accessible by anyone, even a foreigner who's passing through your land. Kind of their own Jewish social security system, where they provided for others. They had to come and gather, but nonetheless, it was there and provided for them. Nobody was going to shoot at them or run them off or anything like that because that was a designated thing. In my mind, I can see how a Jewish farmer, being aware of this principle, might, for instance, divide his land into 7 areas, and each year he would designate that land, that section of land, as this, having the Sabbath year, and giving it rest while the other 6 areas continued to be produced and harvested and that sort of thing. But that provided not only for extra for the owner of the land, but it provided for the other people in the land too. I'm reminding of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz and that beautiful story where Ruth was in the fields of Boaz, and Boaz told his workers to, as you're gleaning the field, as you're cutting the wheat, as you're gathering it together, don't be so worried about getting every little speck of stuff up, but let these who come in, the poor and others, and Ruth was in that group, and allow them to gather what they need, gather enough for their needs without having to be overwrought with that kind of thing, to be able to have some extra here that's theirs to use. That idea of sharing, it's a very Jewish principle, sharing, seeing a relationship with your brothers and sisters and your even foreigners in the land. Oftentimes in the Old Testament we hear that reference about to foreigners in the land. And they were very sensitive to the idea of providing from their abundance and having a system whereby that could be done. In this time, God also directed them to use this land as a gift from Him, to see that it was not something really they owned, so to speak. They were stewards of it. I'm reminding of the American Indians, and many of them had a really hard time when white people started coming into the American continent because they had no concept of ownership of the land. They may have had some territorial boundaries and some things that were set up between themselves and other tribes to keep conflict at a minimum and to allow for successful hunting and that sort of thing. But they didn't have boundaries, and they didn't have surveys, they didn't have maps and deeds and all that sort of thing. They saw the land as being the land, and it was not something that you owned. In fact, you might even think about the land as owning you instead of you owning it, because there was such an interrelationship between human beings and the land. So here's this idea of the Sabbath year. Every 7 years, allowing the ground to rest. We do that today. We do that with rotating crops and that sort of thing. One of the things I do in my garden is I make sure that each year I move things around. I study up a little bit on what kind of nutrients different plants take from the ground. And because of that, I won't put my tomatoes in exactly the same place every year. I move my corn over. I move my green beans over. Move things around. Also, because I know about this need to be replenished and the natural process of that, I've learned a little technique called cover crops. I plant clover on my garden spot in the wintertime, and it grows in the winter, and the clover produces nitrogen, which is a very essential mineral in the soil, and it replenishes that nitrogen that my fruit-bearing crops draw out of the soil in the summertime. So it's a natural fertilizer, as well as providing just some bulk and stuff into the soil so it doesn't get all clumped and that sort of thing. But anyway, all those, I don't want to get too much into all that, but nonetheless, there's a cycle of things of how it all fits together. One thing is dependent on another, and how when we see that cycle and we see God's plan and we see how well He is, all this stuff is organized and put together, we can say, praise God, because He has had the wisdom to foresee the need for all this and provided us with that. And He's even allowed us enough intelligence so that we can study it and see and ascertain for ourselves what's going on there and know the cause and effect of it. Well, that's the Sabbath year. We want to go on, though, in verse 8 and following. We get into another idea here of the year of Jubilee. Says, God says to Moses, count off 7 weeks of years. A week of years would be 7 years, and 7 weeks of years would be 49 years. 7 times 7. That is 7 times 7, so that the 7 weeks of years total 49 years. Then have the trumpet blown on the 10th day of the 7th month. Have the trumpet blown throughout your land on the day of reconciliation. You will make the 50th year holy, proclaiming freedom throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It will be a Jubilee year for you. Each of you must return to your family property and to your extended family. The 50th year will be a Jubilee year for you. Do not plant, do not harvest, similar instructions to what we saw in the Sabbath year. The secondary growth, do not gather from the freely growing vines, because it is a Jubilee. It will be holy to you. You can eat only the produce directly out of the field. Each of you must return to your family property in this year of Jubilee. Don't gather those things and in the sense of storing them away or whatever. They are to be eaten as they grow. And anything that's not eaten as it grows falls to the ground and rots and replenishes the ground in its own way. Each of you must return to your family property in this year of Jubilee. Well, the Jubilee, the year of Jubilee, the year of all that 7 Sabbath years coming together, that 50th year, is something that is really hard to research. Jerusalem the Israelites didn't have many periods of 50 years when they were a stable community. I hate to say it quite that way, but there were just all kinds of things going on. And as you read the Old Testament, you're aware of the wars and the things that were going on constantly with them. And I don't want to be defensive of them and say that's why they seem to have never followed through completely with this year of Jubilee, this 50th year. I sit and I try to rationalize it, and I think, okay, every 7th year you have a year of Jubilee, and you have land that you set aside and you don't harvest from it, you let it replenish. And then on the 50th year, you have another one of these years of Jubilee. That would be, in my understanding, the 49th year would be a year of Sabbath Jubilee, but the 50th year would also be a year of the year of atonement, the year of the Lord, and it's referred to in a lot of different ways in the Bible. Well, like I said, we don't really see that this 50th year returning things to the original state, returning a plot of land to its original group of owners. When the Jews came in and conquered the area around Israel and Galilee and Palestine, those areas, they continued to fight together as a nation. But then as all that was settled, the 12 tribes scattered, and each claimed certain areas, and certainly within those areas they empowered certain families to have this area and this area, and they worked that out in an orderly fashion. And so everyone had a sense of homeland of their own, property of their own. I have a sense of a homeland, but the 40-acre little farm that I grew up on now has about 50 houses on it because it's been turned into a subdivision. And it's a nice area. It's a good use of the land, but I still remember that garden that we used to have, those cows that we used to raise, the big barn, and all the things that I experienced as a boy growing up. But times change and things go on. And this 50th year was a time when you reverted back. We were to revert back. We've never seen don't have any historical references that I was able to find, and a couple of the commentators made mention to this that they too had not found any references to how the land was actually given back. On the other hand, in the Jewish codes, I told you that this area of this part of the book of Leviticus was considered the holiness codes. In the There was a holiness code that was developed by the people who came back from Babylon, the post-exile people. Remember how Ezra found that scroll in the temple and how he brought it forth, and they read the scroll, and the scroll probably contained some of these rules and holiness codes that was in here. And then the people also built on those. And what we find is the Jews had some principles that do follow this pretty closely. They had a principle, first of all, that if you had another Jew who had to revert to being an indentured servant because of debts or whatever, you wouldn't hold them in that category, that position, for more than 6 years. On the 7th year, they would be released from that responsibility. And so that sounds a little bit like this Sabbath year, doesn't it, where they let go. Also, it was a general principle among the Jews that when Jews loaned money to one another, they didn't charge interest. And this 7th year seems to have possibly been a time when sometimes these debts were indeed forgiven. Maybe 7 years after, if you hadn't paid the debt off in 7 years, they just said, forget it, and started over again. I don't know how all that worked then. I know it would be a real mess to try to do that today, wouldn't it? But the point that we want to see in this lesson is that God is the creator. He is the source of all things. And as the creator, he had a plan. He has a plan. He knows what works best. And he wants us to see that our role is not to be dominant, not to just take over and rule things like we've done in so many areas of creation, but he wants us to see ourselves as stewards who use those resources wisely, do everything we can possible to replenish those resources, and to provide for everyone the possibility to break that cycle of generational being poor, to allow families a chance to start again, to give them a mulligans. I used to play golf, and boy, I tell you, I loved the mulligans. That was one of those times when you hit that ball and it just went somewhere you didn't have any intentions for it to go. And if you were playing with a group of folks that were forgiving kind of folks, they'd let you say mulligan, and you drop another ball and hit it again. And hopefully that time you hit it a little better, a little straighter, a little more where you wanted it to go. We all need mulligans, don't we? We need forgiveness. We need Sabbath. We need that rest. We need that time to refocus on God. We need that time to remember our God is an awesome God, and he reigns in heaven above. I hope this lesson will serve to touch your heart in a special way and help you to see God in a special way and to worship him with your pure heart, mind, and soul, as the Jewish people were called to do, and as we as Christians are called to do. God bless you. Hope to see you again next week.